First Sergeant Kep with Company D, 2nd United States Sharpshooters, and thanks for joining us in the field. Today I want to talk to you about a topic that is important to us all, caring for your canvas. Now, being a reenactor, we are very familiar with canvas, but many of us don't actually learn how to properly care for our tenting investments. Now, many modern tents are made out of proprietary canvas, something like Sunforger, which is going to be additionally treated or formulated so that it is additionally waterproof. It's going to be more mildew resistant and provide some fire resistance. Canvas, by its very nature, is a good quality tight woven canvas is naturally waterproof. Once it gets initially wet, the fibers will expand, closing up the weave structure and providing a nice waterproof tent or whatever item that you plan on using. That's why canvas buckets still exist today, and you sometimes see them in the hobby. Oftentimes in our organization, it's the Ice Angels who are carrying around canvas buckets full of ice for us in those hot summer events. But it goes beyond just, can you just keep your tent dry? So what do you do when that big panic comes for most reenactors at an event? Rain. Now, it can be really terrifying or really upsetting for many reenactors because the people who've been doing it for a long time know one of the worst things you can have is wet canvas. Why? Because you have to dry it out. And maybe if you're a young reenactor living at home, or maybe you live in a small apartment or a college dorm, where are you going to have the space to hang up either a dog tent or an A tent or whatever tent you're using to dry it out? It's a big challenge, but it's something that must be done. Why must your canvas always be stored away dry? Well, and that is mildew. The number one destroyer of canvas tents, more than tears or burns, it's going to be mildew that's going to take it long before any of those. Mildew, sucks into the dampness of this cotton material, and it starts to break down the tent. It causes nasty discoloration, and you may have various respiratory sensitivities from that mold and mildew that can grow in this petri dish of environment, which could cause you long-term health discomfort and unpleasantness in the hobby. And even if you manage to catch up and find that mildew, it's still going to stain your investment. Now, if you have an ability to dry it out, normally a rainy day and the last day of an event isn't such a big deal. Occasionally I've had to open up my A tent in my shop and let it dry for a few days, determining on the weather. But at the end of every event, whether you have rain or not, you're going to most likely have morning dew and damp. Other things you need to make sure are completely dried from the material before you pack it away until the next event. One of the key places you need to pay attention to is before you store it away or when you get home is check your bottom seams on all the bottoms of your tent. Now, if you have an A tent or a wall tent with a sod cloth, pay special attention to those. Those areas of the tent to be thicker, sometimes double layered materials. On a shelter half, for example, they're going to be doubled up to have additional strength for the tent ropes, and it will hold on to moisture longer than, say, the ridge or the nice broad surface that's going to be exposed to more sunlight prior to you packing up and putting everything into your car. And so you want to make sure before you store it away that you take the time and you really go around the thick seams of your tent finding moisture and dampness, and you want to make sure that before it gets stored away you dry it completely, and that will prevent mildew. But it doesn't end there. You have to consider about how and where you store your canvas. We live in the Pacific Northwest, and it tends to rain seemingly every day between October and April, May over here. And I store all of my gear in our garage. And periodically throughout the off season, we'll go into the garage and evaluate all of our gear, because the high humidity will also make the materials soak up moisture, which will invite mildew and other sort of destructive agents to your natural materials. Mildew will also greatly affect leather, so make sure you pay attention to how you store your leather goods. Even if you store them, underneath a bed or in a closet, they can accumulate that humidity over the season and start getting fuzzy, and that's not a good way to care for your gear. So take it out and make sure throughout the season that it's still dry, it's not getting mildewy, and just keep an honest eye on it. The other thing you want to do before you store it away is brush it off. You can have all sorts of dirt, sticks, thorns in your material, and being folded up and being stored and packed and unpacked throughout the off season, or even in your knapsack, can cause weakness through abrasion. So it's perfectly fine to take a brush and brush off your tent before you take it off the frame and stow it away in your knapsack or in the trunk of your car on the way home. One thing that the Mrs. First Sergeant and I will do is, as we roll up and fold up our A tent, we'll give it a nice big shake to try to get any additional dirt and debris off the tent. And then if you have any, bird presence left in your tent, you can scrub that out as soon as you can, so that way those sort of natural chemicals don't degrade your canvas. So how do we go about treating and caring for some of the other parts of the tent? Well, let's talk about the ridge poles. Make sure that they're also dry. I paint the bottom of my tent poles, so that way it helps prevent wicking of moisture from the ground into the tent frame. You can also keep your tent pins oiled with some boiled linseed oil. You also want to make sure you brush the dirt off of those before you store them, because that dirt will accumulate moisture and dampness and degrade either your iron tent stakes through rust, or help soften and decompose your wooden implements. Now, issued tent pins were pretty much not treated in any way. I encourage people to keep them well coated with several coats of boiled linseed oil to add to longevity. Because it's one thing, if you want just an event, because soldiers would make a tent pin in the field for one night or a couple of nights and then leave it on the march. We can't afford to just throw our gear away for the sake of authenticity. So investing in making sure that you oil and care for either your iron or your wooden tent pins, make sure they're dried and clean and removed of any sort of dirt or contaminants before they're stored for the long term. One last thing before you hardcores run off is I want to talk about repairing your tents. So whenever your tent, whether it's a shelter tent, a tent, or a wall tent, has a rip, a tear, make sure you mend it as quickly as possible. It doesn't take much for a small tear to end up a devastating rip into the side of your tent. So make sure you always have needle and thread ready to go to patch up your tent. Not only will it make your sleeping much more comfortable, but it will add greatly to the longevity of the canvas. And if you learn a few basic stitches, there are some specialty ones that sailors used. It will not detract from the life or the effectiveness in the tent in the long run, because sail makers were aboard ships repairing sails constantly, and they managed to navigate the world for hundreds of years. So there are actually a few YouTube videos out there on different sail stitches that you could look into, but the concept is, if it's big enough, patch it. Otherwise, stitch it back together. The same goes for buttons and buttonholes. Make sure you have extra buttons on hand. They don't have to match. In fact, if they're mix matched, they would add to the sort of authentic impression of a field repair. And also pay close attention to your holes, whether it's your canvas loops for your stakes or your ropes for your dog tents and stuff like that, because there's a lot of strain from those tent pins on those ropes, and you want to make sure that they're not getting too wore out. You may have to tighten up a buttonhole or add some additional reinforcement. So make sure you just inspect and you get ready to sew. Now, when you're working with thicker materials, you may need more specialty materials. One of those that I highly recommend that you have in your reenacting kit, if you have a tent, are saline needles. And these I got off of Amazon. They're like maybe, I don't know, I think they were less than 15 bucks, maybe 12 bucks. And it's an assortment of needles. And yes, I did get these mostly because as a unit that was originally from Maine, we would have been more familiar with the maritime culture. And as a joiner from a coastal city, odds are at some point I worked on ships. So saline needles, if you're not familiar, these are unique needles. They are pyramid shaped, and they are specially designed for working with heavy fabrics. And they cut through a nice hole, so you have plenty of room to pull something like a nice wax linen thread through your material. These work pretty well, depending on how thick of a repair you need to make and the material we're working with. You should be able to do this with your bare hands, but maybe if you have small hands, or you may have, you know, may not have a lot of strength, or there may be some other sort of age or disability, maybe you have really bad arthritis, then you may want to consider having like a small pair of pliers on hand to help you pull the needles through. Or, again, going with that saline theme, I have a stitching palm. Now this is an antique one that I picked up recently. They still make these. You can get them from Tandy, Amazon, eBay. And what this is instead of having to use your fingers to pull a needle, you can actually use your whole arm to push a needle through. And how it works is you essentially have a thimble sewn right here. And there are some slight historical differences in like the dimple pattern between like a leather maker's palm and a sailing palm. I'm not sure which one this is, but it serves the same purpose. And so you put the needle into one of those dimples, and then you can hold it, and now you can use your whole arm strength to push your needle through your material. This may seem like overkill if you're used to just sewing sort of Joann's cotton sort of stuff, but when you're working with heavy duty materials, whether it's leather or canvas, this sort of setup will really save your hands in the long run. So now we got repairs out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about preserving your canvas. Now, originally these tents were unpreserved. It was just straight off the bolt, and they stitched them up. They, as far as I know, were never pre-shrunk, which made finding another half to button up a challenge sometimes, because the materials would shrink at different rates. And so it was kind of a struggle, because, you know, trying to get the buttonholes to fit, and the materials, you know, one's longer, one's shorter, one's warped and stretched. It was kind of a hassle. They didn't always look as neat as you see modern recreations that are usually paired or really painstakingly fitted to the same pattern. And then they also weren't treated. You know, one soldier famously said that the only thing a dog tent was good for was filtering rainwater. I suppose in heavy, you know, eastern United States downpours, that's very true. We don't get the same type of rain as all of you out there on the east side of the country. And these actually do hold up pretty well in most weather conditions for us out here in the Northwest. But if you want to add some additional waterproofing, maybe you bought or inherited a really old tent and it's showing some wear and tear, or just signs of its age, and you want to get it back up to where it used to be. You want to add a water repellent to your material. Now, for all of you old-timers out there, or those like me who are raised by the old-timers, you may be thinking, oh, Thompson's Water Seal. And I want to say, no. Don't get me wrong. Thompson's Water Seal will absolutely seal canvas. I grew up in hunting camps as a kid and young adult, in wall tents that were just soaked in the stuff, and they absolutely repel water. But it's not good for the canvas. I mean, one, it always smells kind of bad, but prevents the canvas from breathing. So you have really no room for error. All that moisture has to be removed from the canvas prior to storing, because if you have any dampness sandwiched inside that tent, it can't evaporate through the pores of the canvas. And that's why you see a lot of those old tents sort of gray and brown and tan. They're just all stained from years of use. Whereas if you use a product that allows the material to breathe, it retains more of its natural color. This product that I use is called Canvac, not a sponsor, but it works really well. And I wanted to talk about this in sort of our tenting canvas care video, because this is kind of expensive, and you may just have been waiting for a review to make up your mind as to whether or not you want to try this out or not. It's about $40 a gallon, and this will get me, I could probably finish 2 or 3 complete dog tents out of this gallon. I'm not sure how many you would need for various sizes of wall tents, but you know, if you have a bigger tent, it's going to be more of an investment. But like I said, if you have a brand new tent from someone like one of the major sutlers or tent makers, you don't need to do this. That proprietary canvas they're using is excellent. The A tent that I have is 10 years old, and it's as dry on the inside during a rainstorm as my house, so there's no problems there. But when I make these dog tents, I like to use cotton drill. Many contracts for these were actually drill, which is lighter than canvas, which I like. And I'll coat them generally with at least one nice coating of Canvac. And what's great is once the smell goes away in a couple of days, there is no way you will ever know that this canvas has been treated with a modern chemical. The only way you're going to know is if you have a street that's full of dog tents. The ones that I've treated are going to stand out because they have just beads of water just being wicked off the surface. But other than that, the color doesn't change, and it doesn't change any of the sort of tactile qualities of the material. So it's a great way to get a little bit more comfort and protection for your gear and yourself on the inside without giving yourself away. Now, to apply this, there's all sorts of different ways that you can do it. I personally use a garden, those pump garden sprayers. I make sure I have one that has a nice wide nozzle, because if you have a fine tip one, it's just going to clog up and it's going to be really frustrating. So I just fill up the little pump sprayer, and I put a nice even coat all over the canvas, and I'll leave it outside to dry and air out for about 2 days. So you will want to kind of plan ahead weather-wise as far as when you're going to apply it, so that way it has an opportunity for it to do its thing and settle, and so that way you don't have to stink up your house as the stuff sort of just dries off. But after a few days, the smell goes away completely forever, and all that you are left with is a nice piece of waterproof tenting. You can also brush the stuff on, use various types of spray bottles. You just want to apply it as the directions suggest until you get the results that you're looking for. But I've been very happy with it, and this bottle has lasted me quite a while. I haven't made a tent in a while, but I'll do a video on that here coming up in the next couple of months. So yeah, let us know if you have any questions. Before we go, I do think some of you may ask, like, well, what did the soldiers do? Did they do any sort of do they apply like any sort of fix-and wax? Do they do like a wax or an oil canvas? As far as I've read through my research, I don't know of a single soldier modifying or trying to add additional waterproofing to their tent. These were fairly disposable during the Civil War, and definitely in the field, you're just not going to have time to do like like a boiled linseed oil, turpentine, beeswax sort of finish, because you got to make the chemicals in the field. You need a kettle, you need to soak stuff, you got to dry stuff, and even with like the fixing wax, I mean, it's the time and the materials that make it highly unlikely. And also too, soldiers then were just a lot tougher. People in general were used to living outdoors much more than we are today, and they just kind of lived with what they had. But by all means, if you know of a documented source of a soldier during the Civil War actually creating some sort of waterproofing process for their tent. Please let us know down in the comments. We love hearing that sort of new research out there for people. But for the most part, these were just the way that they came. So thanks for liking, commenting, and subscribing and sharing this video, and we'll see you next time.